The sound arrived before comprehension, a mechanical thunder that seemed to split the air itself into fragments of terror and confusion. German soldiers crouching in hastily dug positions across France heard it first as a distant hammering, then as an approaching storm, finally as an overwhelming presence that drowned out thought and prayer alike. The distinctive rhythm of the American M1919 Browning machine gun became the most dreaded soundtrack of the Western Front, a sustained roar that transformed open ground into killing fields and shattered the confidence of even veteran Wehrmacht troops. It was not the largest caliber weapon they faced, nor the most advanced in technical terms. Yet among German infantrymen who survived the war and spoke candidly in later years, no other Allied weapon inspired such immediate, visceral fear as that relentless automatic fire that seemed capable of continuing forever. For young conscripts from Bavaria or Saxony, raised on propaganda films depicting German technological supremacy and tactical brilliance, the first encounter with sustained M1919 fire often shattered far more than their defensive positions. It dismantled assumptions built over years of training and indoctrination. Sergeant Klaus Reinhardt, captured near St. Lo in August 1944, later described the moment his reinforced platoon attempted to cross an open field during a counterattack. Within 5 seconds of the first burst, he recalled, 13 men fell before anyone could react or seek cover. The survivors pressed themselves against the earth with such desperate force that several broke ribs against embedded stones, willing their bodies to merge with the soil itself. He remembered thinking, as glowing tracers carved luminous paths overhead and impacts threw dirt across his vision, that this bore no resemblance to warfare as he understood it. This was industrial slaughter, mechanical and utterly impersonal, delivered by a weapon that appeared never to pause for breath, never to overheat despite continuous fire, never to exhaust its ammunition supply. The fear was not born of panic or imagination. It emerged from bitter experience, from watching the weapon demonstrate capabilities that German machine guns struggled to match under battlefield conditions. The M1919 could sustain rates of fire between 400 and 600 rounds per minute, and unlike many German weapons that demanded frequent barrel changes or mandatory cooling periods, the Browning could maintain that devastating tempo for extended durations without catastrophic mechanical failure. American crews trained relentlessly in barrel change procedures that could be completed in less than 30 seconds, often performed in complete darkness by touch alone, keeping weapons operational when German gunners still wrestled with overheated metal that could burn through gloves. The psychological impact of such sustained fire cannot be overstated or easily conveyed to those who never experienced it. When a weapon fires continuously for minutes at a time, suppressing entire sections of battlefield and denying all movement within its beaten zone, the human mind begins interpreting it not as a tool wielded by mortal men, but as a force of nature itself, implacable and omnipresent as weather or gravity. What German soldiers encountered was far more than merely an effective machine gun. They faced the manifestation of American industrial philosophy applied directly to warfare, a weapon system that embodied principles of mass production, component standardization, and reliability engineering that German industry, despite its reputation for precision craftsmanship, struggled to replicate under wartime conditions. Every M1919 component was manufactured to tolerances, allowing parts from weapons built in different factories across America to function seamlessly together without hand fitting or adjustment. When a firing pin fractured or a spring wore beyond tolerance, replacement took minutes rather than hours. German armorers, trained in traditions of hand-fitting components and making careful field modifications, found themselves envying an enemy whose weapons required no such artisanal intervention. The Browning simply worked, repeatedly and reliably, in mud and rain and sub-zero cold, with mechanical consistency that seemed almost supernatural to soldiers whose own equipment frequently failed under similar conditions. Yet, before understanding why this particular weapon became the specter haunting German infantrymen across Europe, we must journey back to training grounds throughout America, where young men who had never heard hostile fire were systematically transformed into machine gun crews capable of delivering that terrifying firepower with cold, practiced efficiency. The transformation began in camps scattered across the United States, thousands of miles from any battlefield, where drill instructors taught fundamentals that would later determine the difference between survival and death on European soil. What recruits learned there transcended the simple mechanics of pulling triggers and loading belts. Private First Class Robert Henderson arrived at Fort Benning from rural Kansas in early 1943, expecting basic instruction in shooting. What he received instead was an intensive education in what instructors called mechanical theology, treating the M1919 not as mere equipment, but as a complex system whose every component demanded understanding, respect, and constant maintenance. Henderson and fellow trainees were required to disassemble and reassemble the weapon while blindfolded, their fingers learning the geography of feed mechanisms and bolt assemblies until they could diagnose common malfunctions by touch alone in complete darkness. They memorized the weight and function of every component, the proper tension of every spring, the precise angle at which ammunition belts should feed for optimal reliability. They learned to sleep with gun oil scent on their hands, to dream about timing adjustments and headspace settings that could mean the difference between reliable function and catastrophic failure under fire. The training regimen was relentless, almost obsessive in its attention to detail, because instructors knew with certainty what awaited these young men. They had studied after-action reports from North Africa and Sicily, accounts describing German infantry emerging from defensive positions only to be scythed down by American machine gun fire so intense and sustained it created what appeared to be physical barriers in the air itself. The M1919 represented far more than a weapon in American tactical doctrine. It was the primary answer to German infantry tactics, emphasizing aggressive maneuver and assault, a tool designed to break enemy formations before they could close to effective rifle range. American commanders had studied European warfare extensively and concluded that mobility, combined with overwhelming suppressive firepower, would shatter opposing forces more effectively than attempts to match German tactical flexibility. The M1919 became the instrument of that operational philosophy, and training reflected the deadly seriousness of its intended role. Beyond mechanical proficiency, crews learned to think in terms of beaten zones and grazing fire, mathematical concepts that transformed simple shooting into a form of lethal geometry. A beaten zone represented the elliptical area where bullets would impact at roughly chest height for standing or kneeling men, creating killing fields that required no precise aim, only proper weapon positioning and correct range estimation. Grazing fire meant adjusting trajectories so rounds never rose more than 6 feet above ground level across hundreds of yards of distance, ensuring that anyone caught in the open had no safe posture, no way to avoid the stream of metal regardless of whether they stood, knelt, or crawled. German soldiers would later describe advancing against such fire as walking into invisible walls. You could not perceive the barrier until men ahead of you simply collapsed without warning, and by then circumstances allowed only two choices: seek immediate cover or join the fallen in the mud. American crews trained extensively in mutual support tactics, positioning multiple machine guns so their fields of fire overlapped comprehensively, eliminating dead ground where enemy infantry might advance safely. This defensive methodology created networks of interlocking fire capable of stopping battalion-strength attacks with company-sized forces, multiplying combat effectiveness far beyond simple numerical strength. The Germans employed their own sophisticated machine gun tactics built around the legendary MG-42, but American doctrine emphasized sustained suppression and redundant coverage over the MG-42's higher cyclic rate. Where German doctrine encouraged firing in shorter, more economical bursts to conserve ammunition and preserve barrel life, American gunners were explicitly taught to maintain fire as long as targets remained visible or suspected, trusting in supply systems that could deliver ammunition in quantities that German logistics officers found almost incomprehensible. That supply system represented another dimension of American military philosophy that German forces consistently underestimated until experience taught harsh lessons. The United States produced approximately 250,000 Browning machine guns in various configurations during World War II, accompanied by billions of rounds of .30 caliber ammunition. American factories operated continuously around the clock, staffed by workers who would never see combat, but whose labor on assembly lines proved as strategically decisive as any firefight. German industry, increasingly disrupted by strategic bombing and chronically starved for raw materials, could not approach such output levels. Wehrmacht units frequently faced ammunition shortages requiring strict rationing and fire discipline, while American crews enjoyed relative abundance that seemed almost wasteful to their opponents. A German squad leader captured in Normandy expressed bitter amazement upon learning that American machine gunners sometimes expended hundreds of rounds in training exercises, serving no purpose except practice and familiarization. His own unit had been restricted to 10 rounds per man per week for training during the months preceding D-Day. When American forces stormed ashore in France on June 6, 1944, the M1919 accompanied them in multiple configurations: water-cooled versions established in defensive positions, air-cooled variants mounted on vehicles, and distributed among infantry platoons. German defenders, many of them Eastern Front veterans who had survived brutal combat against Soviet forces, expected fierce fighting, but believed their experience and fortified positions would exact terrible costs from the invaders. What they encountered instead was a storm of automatic weapons fire unlike anything most had faced previously. American infantry advanced behind rolling barrages of machine gun fire that suppressed German positions so effectively that defenders frequently could not raise their heads to return fire. When they attempted to do so, when some brave or desperate soldier tried engaging the advancing Americans, every machine gun within range would immediately concentrate fire on his position, transforming it into a maelstrom of ricochets and impacts that achieved kills not through surgical accuracy, but through sheer, overwhelming volume. Corporal Werner Schultz fought with a Wehrmacht infantry regiment near Carentan, and later described the sound as the most terrifying experience of his entire war. It was not the sharp crack of rifles or the howling shriek of artillery shells, but rather a sustained mechanical grinding that seemed to vibrate directly in his chest cavity. He recalled moments when the noise became so overwhelming that coherent thought became impossible, when his entire world narrowed to just the earth immediately before his face and the impacts throwing dirt and fragments into his eyes. His company began the Normandy campaign with 143 men at full strength. After merely 2 weeks of continuous fighting against American forces that seemed to possess unlimited ammunition and an almost casual willingness to expend it freely, fewer than 50 remained combat effective. Schultz himself survived only through grotesque fortune when an American machine gun burst struck the ammunition pouches of the soldier beside him, triggering secondary explosions that killed his comrade instantly, but created enough smoke and confusion for Schultz to crawl backwards to relative safety. The devastating effectiveness of American machine gun tactics became particularly evident during hedgerow fighting, where the Norman bocage created hundreds of small, isolated battlefields separated by thick earthen berms topped with dense vegetation. German defenders would fortify hedgerow intersections or stone farmhouses, confident that the ancient earthworks and thick walls provided excellent cover against small arms fire. American units approaching such positions deployed machine guns systematically, positioning them to fire through gaps in vegetation or along the linear corridors created by hedgerow lines, denying German soldiers any safe movement within the defensive position. Infantry would then advance directly under that covering fire, knowing with certainty that any enemy fighter who rose to shoot would draw immediate suppression from multiple Browning guns positioned to support the assault. The tactic was methodical, almost industrial in its systematic application. It lacked the dramatic flair of armored breakthroughs or airborne assaults, but it ground down German resistance with inexorable efficiency that accumulated over days and weeks. Veterans from both sides spoke in later years about the profound psychological dimensions of this firepower disparity. For American soldiers, the M1919 represented security and confidence, tangible knowledge that they possessed a weapon capable of dominating virtually any small arms engagement if properly employed and supported. For Germans, it embodied a growing realization that this war, unlike their earlier campaigns through Poland and France, where tactical brilliance and aggressive initiative carried the day, would not be won through superior tactics or individual courage alone. They faced an enemy who had industrialized warfare to a degree that made traditional military virtues increasingly irrelevant against material superiority. One German officer captured during the Battle of the Bulge admitted frankly to his interrogators that his men feared American machine guns more intensely than American artillery. Artillery could be predicted through sound ranging, avoided through proper use of terrain, waited out in deep bunkers and fortified positions. But the machine guns worked everywhere simultaneously, immediate and intensely personal in their lethality, and they never seemed to stop firing once they began. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 provided brutal demonstration of the M1919's defensive capabilities when employed by trained crews in prepared positions. When German forces launched their surprise winter offensive through the Ardennes forest, they achieved dramatic initial success through speed, surprise, and overwhelming local numerical superiority. But as American units recovered from the initial shock and established coherent defensive positions, the familiar pattern reemerged with devastating clarity. Infantry and armor formations found themselves advancing into carefully prepared networks of interlocking machine gun fire that channeled their movement into predetermined killing zones and slowed their operational momentum. At critical road junctions and river crossing sites, small groups of American soldiers equipped with M1919s held off much larger German forces for hours, sometimes entire days, buying precious time for reinforcements to arrive and counterattacks to be organized. One such engagement occurred near the besieged town of Bastogne, where a platoon of American paratroopers established a hasty defensive position with two M1919 machine guns covering the only viable approach road through densely forested terrain. When a full-strength German infantry company attempted to force the position through direct assault, the machine guns opened fire at maximum effective range, forcing attackers to deploy from marching column and seek whatever cover the frozen ground offered. For the next 6 hours, the American gunners maintained almost continuous fire whenever German soldiers attempted to advance or maneuver for better positions. They expended more than 10,000 rounds of ammunition during that engagement, resupplied by volunteers who made dangerous runs through sporadic artillery fire from the main defensive perimeter. The German company, unable to advance against the concentrated fire and unwilling to retreat and admit failure, suffered more than 60 casualties before finally withdrawing under cover of darkness. The two American machine gunners survived without serious injury, protected by their carefully selected position and the suppressing effect of their own devastating weapons. German commanders later cited this engagement as tragically typical of the operational frustrations they faced throughout the Ardennes offensive. No amount of courage, tactical skill, or determination could overcome an enemy capable of delivering such concentrated, sustained fire with such mechanical efficiency. Yet the fear German soldiers experienced toward the M1919 transcended rational assessment of its technical capabilities and tactical employment. There was something deeply disturbing, almost uncanny, about the weapon's mechanical consistency. The way it fired with metronomic rhythm that felt profoundly inhuman. German machine guns like the MG-42 fired faster, producing their infamous sound that Allied soldiers called Hitler's buzzsaw. But that very speed necessitated shorter bursts and more frequent barrel changes to prevent catastrophic overheating. The M1919, firing at its steady 400 to 600 rounds per minute, could maintain fire until ammunition supplies were exhausted or the barrel wore through from sustained use. That sustained hammering produced psychological effects that faster but necessarily shorter bursts could not replicate. It created the overwhelming impression that Americans possessed unlimited ammunition stocks and almost supernatural endurance, that the guns would continue firing long after German weapons fell silent from overheating or ammunition exhaustion. German infantry developed various tactical methods attempting to counter American machine gun positions, but all approaches involved accepting significant casualties as inevitable costs. The preferred method involved using smoke grenades and supporting artillery to close rapidly under concealment, hoping to reach the gun position before crews could relocate to alternate positions. But American doctrine explicitly emphasized immediate withdrawal under direct pressure, falling back to predetermined secondary positions where other machine guns could cover the withdrawal route with overlapping fire. Assault troops found themselves pursuing enemies who refused to be decisively pinned, who would fire intensively, displace rapidly, then resume firing from new angles, always maintaining that terrible pressure that made advance costly and coordination difficult. In the static trench warfare of World War I, machine gun positions could be identified, targeted, and systematically eliminated through patient artillery bombardment. In the fluid, mobile combat characterizing World War II, American crews moved constantly, setting up quickly, firing effectively, then displacing before German forces could organize coordinated responses. Some German veterans, interviewed decades after the war, spoke with lingering sense of profound unfairness about their experiences. They had been raised on cultural narratives emphasizing German technical superiority, celebrating German engineering precision and manufacturing quality. Yet here was an American weapon that seemed simpler, cruder in certain design aspects, but which functioned with reliability that German weapons struggled to match under equivalent field conditions. The M1919 was not elegant in any aesthetic sense. It was heavy, weighing 31 pounds without mount or ammunition, making it cumbersome for rapid displacement. Its basic design dated back to World War I, lacking the advanced features incorporated in some German weapons. But it was brutally, consistently effective in accomplishing its designed purpose, and in warfare, effectiveness ultimately matters far more than elegance or theoretical sophistication. The German soldiers who faced it came to respect the weapon in the way one respects any dangerous force of nature, something implacable that cannot be reasoned with or intimidated. The weapon's impact extended well beyond direct combat effects and casualty statistics. The distinctive sound of M1919 fire became an acoustic marker of American presence, an audible warning that a position was occupied by prepared troops. German reconnaissance patrols learned to identify different weapons by their characteristic sounds, and the distinctive hammering rhythm of a Browning machine gun meant immediate withdrawal and route reassessment. Commanders planning attacks factored known or suspected machine gun positions heavily into operational planning, sometimes abandoning tactical objectives entirely if intelligence suggested heavy concentrations of American automatic weapons defending the target. The M1919 thus exerted strategic influence even when not actively firing, simply through the threat its presence represented. German infantrymen moved more cautiously through terrain offering good fields of fire, advanced more slowly across open ground, constantly aware that any moment that terrible sound might erupt and their ordered world would dissolve into chaos. American crews, understanding their weapons' psychological impact, developed almost religious devotion to their Browning guns. They gave weapons individual names, personalized them with painted insignia and nose art, treated them with care that transcended mere maintenance requirements. A machine gunner's weapon was his lifeline, the primary tool that would keep him and his squad alive through the next engagement and the one after that. Stories circulated widely of crews who refused to abandon damaged M1919s even under heavy fire and withdrawal pressure, dragging the awkward 40-pound weapons through mud and across rivers rather than leave them behind for enemy capture. This was partly practical calculation. Machine guns were tactically valuable and not easily replaced in forward positions. But it was equally emotional attachment. The weapon had saved their lives countless times through dozens of engagements. Abandoning it felt like personal betrayal of a trusted companion. The relationship between American soldiers and their machine guns created combat effectiveness that German forces found increasingly difficult to counter as the war progressed. Well-trained crews operating reliable weapons with abundant ammunition, supported by supply systems capable of delivering thousands of rounds to frontline positions within hours of request, represented a combination of factors that German forces, stretched progressively thinner and chronically resource-starved by late 1944, simply could not match or counter effectively. Wehrmacht units still possessed individually skilled soldiers and tactically experienced officers, but they fought with diminishing ammunition stocks, aging equipment showing accumulated wear, and the crushing psychological burden of knowing that every engagement cost them irreplaceable resources, while their enemies seemed to possess inexhaustible material reserves. By spring 1945, as Allied forces pushed across the Rhine into Germany itself, the sound of the M1919 had become the acoustic soundtrack of inevitable defeat for German soldiers. They heard that mechanical hammering in the ruins of their own cities, in forests and fields of their homeland, the same relentless rhythm that had pursued them from the beaches of Normandy, through Belgium, and across the Rhine barrier. For some, there developed almost a sense of fatalistic inevitability. The weapon had become symbolic of American military might more broadly, representing an industrial power capable of producing not merely weapons, but entire equipped armies, capable of feeding those armies and supplying them with such material abundance that machine gunners could fire thousands of rounds without worrying about ammunition conservation. In the final chaotic weeks of European war, German soldiers surrendered in rapidly increasing numbers, often citing the hopelessness of continued fighting against such overwhelming material superiority. Interrogation reports from that period frequently mention American automatic weapons as significant factors in decisions to surrender rather than fight to destruction. Men spoke of watching comrades cut down by fire they could not see the source of and could not effectively return, of the psychological exhaustion resulting from constant exposure to that mechanical death that seemed capable of finding anyone who moved. Some expressed grudging professional admiration for the weapon itself, carefully separated from any political feelings about the war's causes or conduct. The M1919 was, they acknowledged, with the objectivity of soldiers assessing tools, a superb instrument for its intended purpose, and that purpose was killing efficiently at ranges where individual marksmanship mattered far less than sustained volume of fire. When war ended in May 1945, American forces found themselves in possession of hundreds of thousands of machine guns, many showing surprisingly little wear despite months or years of combat employment. The M1919 would continue serving in Korea, Vietnam, and numerous smaller conflicts spanning decades, its fundamental design proving so sound that it remained in military inventories long after more modern weapons became available. But its psychological impact was perhaps greatest during World War II, when it represented not merely a weapon, but an entire philosophy: the American conviction that industrial might and technological reliability could overcome any enemy regardless of their tactical skill or fighting spirit.
Für den German Soldaten, die faced it across European battlefields, das Philosophie wurde grimmlich korrekt again and again, at costs they measured in friends and comrades lost, to a sound that would echo in their memories through the remainder of their lives. The fear was earned through experience. It was rational response to demonstrated capability. It represented recognition that some enemies cannot be defeated through courage or tactical skill alone. That modern warfare sometimes reduces to mathematics, industrial resources, and the cold efficiency of well-manufactured machines in the hands of well-trained operators. The M1919 was not invincible or indestructible. It could jam under certain conditions, overheat if fired beyond recommended limits, be destroyed by artillery or armor. But it was reliable enough, abundant enough, and effectively employed enough that German infantry came to dread its presence above almost any other battlefield threat.
That dread was the sound of industrial warfare made audible, mechanical, and implacable. The voice of a nation that had turned its factories and engineering genius toward the singular purpose of winning through overwhelming material superiority. For those who survived to remember it decades later, the hammering rhythm of the M1919 remained the most terrifying sound of their war. The voice of a weapon that seemed never to tire, never to falter, never to run dry. It was the sound of inevitability itself, and in the end, inevitability won.